A new documentary titled Who We Are, based on archival footage, and a lecture by Jeffery Robinson, former Deputy Legal Director at the American Civil Liberties Union, focuses on the legacy of slavery and racism in the U.S. It was released on Netflix earlier this month.
We're 50 years later now. Once again, America is having to look at issues of race dead in the eye, and once again, we are at a tipping point. And the question for all of us in this room is, what are we going to do about it?
Joining me now is Jeffery Robinson, founder and executive director of the Who We Are project. Jeffery Robinson, as the U.S. marks Juneteenth, second year as a federal holiday, Opa Lee, the 95-year-old so-called grandmother of Juneteenth, said it should be a day of, quote, great unity, the other half of the 4th of July, Independence Day. She pointed out that these are dates that fall just 2 weeks apart, but how much unity is there in America today around the legacy of slavery and its place in American history?
I think it's difficult to have unity on an issue like that when people don't know the truth about our history. So if there are a group of people who believe that our history is one thing and another group of people who believe that our history is something radically different, how you find unity there is very difficult for me to figure out. And I think that's one of the purposes of the Who We Are project. We want to bring people the truth, the good, the bad, the great, and the horrible of American history. And if we all know the truth about what happened, we can then sit down and find unity in that truth moving forward from it.
Is it about knowing the truth or rejecting the truth? Because your documentary, Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America, which I just watched, is as bold as it is direct. In fact, in the first few seconds, you ask people in the audience who you're speaking to raise their hands if they've ever owned a slave. Of course, no one does, but you tell them slavery, quote, is not our fault. We didn't do it. We didn't cause it. It's not our responsibility, but it is our shared history. And you caution people not to belittle it, not to turn it into something that it is not. Who were you speaking to? Was it the white supremacists in America today or others who simply don't know the history of slavery and America?
This movie was made for everyone. I discovered many of the facts in this movie, not all of them, but many of them, when I was in my 50s. And I've had one of the best educations in America. Some people have said, well, are you making this movie for the choir? And my response is, the problem is the choir doesn't know this song. The choir may be singing something that sounds familiar, but if you don't know the facts of how our country was formed and why certain decisions are made, then you can't figure out where we should go forward. It was said most ominously by George Orwell, who controls the past, controls the future. And if we want to make decisions today going forward that make sense, then we better base those decisions on what actually happened in the past to bring us to this point.
It's about informing, as you say, but is it also about confronting people whose sense and knowledge of history isn't as accurate as it should be? In the documentary, you confront a white man carrying a Confederate flag, which represented the 11 southern states that seceded from the United States between 1860 and 1861 to protect the institution of slavery. It triggered the Civil War. Their flag still represents today slavery and white supremacy, and we saw it hoisted in the Capitol building on January 6th. How much of a threat to American unity is white supremacy today? How much of a resurgent, divisive force is it in 2022?
That's one of the things that I'm trying to point out about with this film and with the work that the Who We Are project is doing. People will look at what's happening today and say, oh my God, this is new. This is coming out of nowhere. And there was a famous baseball player in America who was famous for kind of funny sayings. And his name was Yogi Berra. And he would look at this and say, this is like deja vu all over again. It's not that white supremacists are just now a threat in America. They have always been there. And that's what this film is showing, is that there is an unbroken history of this kind of behavior and this kind of philosophy that has gone up and down at some points in America, but we are not seeing anything new. What we are seeing is exactly the same philosophy, the same behaviors, and the same values that were existing way, way back in American history. And the question is, if we can see it for what it is, can we finally confront it? So you use the word confrontation. And that is right, because what we are talking about is America's creation story. And when you are challenging a creation story, people get very, very upset.
And you say in the film quite unapologetically that you say this, you argue that the people who founded this country, the United States, had no problem with white supremacy. In fact, they depended on it to make America a great nation. A week before Dr. Martin Luther King was shot outside room 306 at the Lorraine Motel on the 4th of April, 1968, which you show the place where he was shot in your documentary. A week later, you were just 11 years old. You went with your father to a demonstration that turned violent. You said, we were on a path to racial justice. We were seemingly at a tipping point where we were either going to roll forward or roll back. 50 years on, more than 50 years later, where does America stand? Is it at another tipping point, and which way will it go?
You know, I think we are at another tipping point. And tipping points in a country with a 400-year history, they don't last for a minute or for an event like George Floyd's murder, or for an event like the insurrection on January 6th. They last for a decade, maybe longer. So the tipping point that I was talking about in 2018, when that stage presentation was filmed, we're at the same tipping point today. And we have come to these points in different places in American history on the issue of racial justice, and we have already rolled back, always rolled back. So I would say this: I am an optimist. I believe that action causes hope, and there is lots of action that I see in America today that does give me hope, even though I know there is an opposition out there. But this is America's last best chance to get this right. Because if we roll back now, I don't know what the heck we're rolling back to. And I don't know how long it will take us to dig out of that hole to get back just to where we are right now. So this is our last best chance. But I think people understand that. And that's why there's so much tension in the air in America, because people understand that we are at a precipice, and it's important which way we're going to go.
But do enough people in America today see the country as it is in its entirety? Because you say quite poignantly in your lecture, people are many things. Countries aren't just one either. America has demonstrated, you say time and again, its greatness. And America is one of the most racist countries on the face of the earth. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. It is not an either or. These are your words. Do enough people see America as it is, not an either or?
I think not. And I think that's one of the reasons for this film and for the other educational work that the Who We Are Project is going to do.
Does it
And
matter,
I think
though?
that,
Does it matter that they see it in its entirety?
oh, it matters completely. It matters completely, because what we're talking about is, how do we take an issue of racial justice today? For example, and I'll just do this quickly, if you never knew about the Tulsa massacre, and you were looking at the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and trying to decide, why is this Black neighborhood so depressed? Why are all the businesses closed down? Why isn't there a much better community here? Black people just need to work harder. If you knew nothing about the Tulsa massacre, you could look at that and come to that conclusion, but you would be wrong. And when you try to solve for the problems that are there, you'll be solving for a problem that doesn't exist. and you will be ignoring the reason that problem occurred. So in order for us to move forward, it is necessary for us to look at what brought us to this place. It's not complicated. And human beings are like this. I was a criminal defense lawyer. I represented people who were wonderful people, but people who did bad things. It's not either or, and it never has been. Every person listening to us right now, including you and I, have acted as saints at times in our lives, and we've been sinners at times in our lives. That's just the human condition. So all we're doing is saying to people, take a step back and understand that greatness and racism can coexist, but not forever.
Some might say, what is the point of looking backward? Let bygones be bygones. I mean, you point out that there were so many laws that were problematic, especially in the state of Virginia. You even show a passage from the national anthem in your documentary, written by a slave owner, Francis Scott Key, in which, if I just quoted a passage from the national anthem, it is quite important. It says, "No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave." You say the Star-Spangled Banner, the U.S. national anthem, celebrated the murder of enslaved people. Is anyone making a fuss about that?
Well, I think people haven't made a fuss about it because it hasn't been common knowledge. One of the reasons that you see all these people in America screaming about this thing called critical race theory, don't teach my fourth grader critical race theory. Well, two things. Critical race theory is a law school course, and quite frankly, there's nothing wrong with it, but that's for another discussion. But number two, why are they so afraid of teaching the truth about history? Because their children will understand that the reason America looks like it does today, with the huge gap between Black and white America at every socioeconomic measure you can find, children will look at that and either say, that's the way it should be because those people don't work hard enough, or they'll look at it and say, understanding what really happened in the past, I understand why it looks this way, and we've got to do something about it. That's what's at stake.
How important is the issue of reparations when you say doing something about it? Because you look back at history, in fact, you show this very well. You say that by 1835, cotton from enslaved people's labor accounted for 55% of US exports. By 1860, it apparently was 60% of US exports. There were more than 4 million enslaved people by then working America's cotton fields. It was a critical part of America's growth and expansion economically. 12 US presidents, again, something that you mentioned, owned enslaved people. How important is it to know this and to do something about it? And what should be done?
I think when people think about reparations, there is a bill in front of Congress right now, H.R. 40. It would create a committee that would look at and study our true history and make recommendations about reparations for slavery and the vestiges of slavery that continued after the Civil War and up to and including until today. Some people forget, and I like to remind folks, after the Civil War, separate but equal was the law in America for 89 years. So it wasn't like it went from the Civil War directly to freedom. And so when people think of reparations, they usually think we can't do that, that's impossible, it doesn't make sense. And this is where our history is so important, because we can say, oh, but you don't understand, we've already paid reparations for slavery. Abraham Lincoln paid Washington, D.C. slave owners, not everyone in America, just Washington, D.C. area slave owners, $1 million in 1862 money for lost property. He passed this law 6 months before he passed the Emancipation Proclamation. So he was paying slave owners for lost property. Reparations for slavery have been paid to slave owners. Japanese Americans were paid $1.6 billion for 3.5 years of imprisonment and rights and land that they lost. that didn't come close to compensating them for what they actually lost, but it was an important recognition of what happened. And so good policy going forward is absolutely necessary. But good policy going forward can keep the gaps where they are. If you are talking about closing these gaps, then reparations is what we have to look at. And the last thing I'd like to say about it is, don't let anybody tell you, oh, this is about putting money in people's pockets and this person will get it and they don't deserve it. And there are these problems with it. All of the arguments that people talk about now were in existence and dealt with by the Japanese American community when they got reparations in 1988. So these are not new arguments. There doesn't have to be one field of thought for this thing to move forward. The only thing we have to agree upon is that there are things that have been done to Black Americans throughout history that explain why America looks like it does today. And to fix that, we have to address what happened in the past, and we have to move forward with good policy. You can't do one without the other.
All right, Jeffery Robinson, such a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.